Just a quick review of the veneers used in this project. Oak burl for the main visual interest. Bloodwood for the accent strips that are going to surround the main visual interest, the oak burl. And then overall base of the base box veneer is Shadua, Mozambique, Ovankal. Those are the other names for it. If you recall in the very first video, I used a piece of cardboard with a square cut out in it that allowed me to screen out and select a section of this veneer so that I can kind of make it easier for me to find a section of this veneer that's usable for this project. It has to do with the cluster size is what I'm looking for, an overall even density without flaws, color changes and such. Just something about oak burl that I just love using for these type of projects. Plus, this oak burl happens to be a very flat sheet, which is oak burl is a very notorious veneer for needing to be pressed flat ahead of time. This particular piece was fairly flat to begin with. Now that I have a piece harvested, that I cut it oversized, of course, so that I don't have to be so tight on how I'm going to fit it into the project. Now it's time to mount or bond the main visual interest burl, in this case, onto the lid. Essentially, I know it's going to be centered in the middle of that lid, so I've already mocked it up on another piece of scrap wood, so I know exactly how big the square is going to be and how kind of get an idea where the veneer is going to go. So in this case, I transferred my lines. Those double parallel lines are actually where the bloodwood was going to go. That's the accent strip that's going to surround it, and then the remainder is going to be the Ovankal as a wraparound. I like to use epoxy for the adhesive. One, it dries really rigid versus a PVC type of adhesive. It really just remains into a plastic state, whereas the epoxy really bonds really well and is a firm or rigid adhesive when it fully cures. Those circles that I draw on there are actually meant for you to kind of give you an idea, if you're not familiar with working with epoxy, how much is necessary to mix to get a idea of how much epoxy is needed to actually cover that particular surface area. That little stir stick I'm using is just this little scrap piece of veneer, and you want to hang on to that. I'm going to use it here in a second as a squeegee to move the epoxy around so that it just sticks within the inside corners or inside pieces of the where the burl is actually going to be mounted. I try to do my best to keep it within those lines. I want 100% coverage on the inside. A little bit slop's okay, but you'll see here I'm actually making a mistake in the video, or mistake in this process here. You want to ensure that you don't have any real globs of epoxy in one area, because whenever it dries, if it has a bump or ridge in the epoxy, it dries stiff like that, and then it becomes, when you go to sand, it becomes a high spot. And then when you go to sand it flush, you'll see that it actually telegraphs to the surface. You might get a sand through. So here I'm just squeegeeing out or forcing the veneer down into the liquid adhesive. And of course, as burls tend to have a lot of little tiny miniature little voids and such, and the epoxy's already bled through, which is okay, it's expected. My bottom platens to protect the inside veneer, or inside veneer of the lid, so from the clamps. See, I'm holding on to that little sliver of veneer, or that little sliver of veneer I use as a stir stick, because when the epoxy cures on it, it's cured underneath the veneer, so you know when it's done. So that's the idea about hanging on that little stir stick. I'm usually not that clumsy dealing with these clamps, because you really got to pay attention to what you're doing, because 5-minute epoxy is 5 minutes. There's no forgiveness when you're working with epoxy on the time. It doesn't fully dry to a full stiffness, but it just simply will not bond anything after the time limit's up. It still remains a little bit flat or pliable. You're just finishing up placing the clamps, and again hanging on to that little stir stick, because that's the timer I'm going to use. So when it's dry and stiff on that piece of veneer, it's dry and stiff underneath the burl. So 5-minute epoxy. Now it's time to take the clamps off and see how well I did. And then remember I said earlier I made a mistake? Well, you'll see here in a minute what's going to happen. I said this was 5-minute epoxy. Turns out it was 8-minute epoxy. At least that's how long it took me to get to this point where I removed the clamps. I got a little distracted and came back to it, and the epoxy actually set up a lot harder and stiffer than it normally would. And it's actually flat and well bonded. That's not my concern. It's actually getting the excess veneer cut off. Typically, right after 5 minutes is up, it's well bonded, but the tack hasn't fully cured yet. So any of that excess veneer outside where the accent strip's going to go will peel off quite easily. Here, I'm going to start with a straight edge. Going to use a safety razor blade to cut through the oak burl down to the substrate. And normally this is a fairly clean type process where I just essentially a few strokes, peel that up, and that veneer just pops right off because I said the epoxy hasn't fully cured yet. But you can see here I'm using a chisel and having a little bit of a time trying to get it off. So take it from me, don't get distracted. When it's 5-minute epoxy, it's 5-minute epoxy. Eventually did get it all off, but it was a lot more effort than it needed to be. And don't worry about the bleed through on the surface of the veneer. In this case, the epoxy, it actually works as a grain filler or pore filler to some degree. And I'll be sanding it back so it's invisible at that point. And the accent strips I actually have to create myself out of the bloodwood. Here I'm just harvesting a small section out of it. I'm kind of preserve the bloodwood as putting it back to my spare pile. It's kind of a scarce item with me. But the one thing I was negligent about stating earlier in the videos, saying save all your scraps. We're going to use the iron-on veneer method for edge banding, the exposed plywood edges, and for the surrounding or the band veneers that are going to be around the oak burl, and then the edge banding that's going to go around that. So here, the iron-on veneer method is just essentially you coat one side of the veneer with a layer of PVA adhesive, letting it dry to a translucent color, from yellow to translucent, typically an hour or longer. And you do the same thing with the substrate, and then with a warm clothes iron, you put the veneer over top where you want to bond it to, and then with the iron you press it in place. Cutting consistent with inlay strips is actually pretty easy. I have a video, it's called Cut Inlay Strips Perfect Every Time. I'll post a link up above, but essentially there's the same process here I'm showing. And here in this case I have a known distance, in this case a 5/16 inch drill bit trapped between two straight edges. The veneer is butted up against one of the straight edges, the drill bit's trapped in between. When the straight edges is taken away, as well as the spacer, using a new safety razor blade, take several light passes to the veneer that's exposed, hence a 5/16 inch strip of veneer. And just to make several light passes, get a very nice consistent width strip. And I'm going to suggest that you make more than you need. These veneers actually are pretty fragile, and handling it, there's a real possibility that you might snap one, or in case if you cut one inappropriately, you have a spare already made. Just take your time. It's pretty simple process. Now it's time to add the accent strips around the main visual interest, in this case the oak burl. I'm using the iron-on method. We've already prepared the veneers ahead of time and the substrate. It's got a coat of dried veneer. And again, the iron-on process is using a warm clothes iron. The heat will reactivate the glue and cause it to instantly tack. What's not so readily apparent here in this video is I'm using the tip of the iron to just touch the bloodwood and the oak burl right at that join line. So if there's any shrinkage in the bloodwood, it's going to pull from the unanchored side of the veneer. So there won't be a gap between the oak burl and the bloodwood. Just some light pressure, the heat's going to do the work. What's not so also visible, using my fingers, I'm actually drawing in the veneer, in this case the accent strip, tight up against the edge of the oak burl, so it's anchoring it in place. I'm also not anchoring the bloodwood all the way out to the outer edges. You'll see here in a minute what that's about. Just going to repeat this 2 more times. This actually goes pretty quick. This is also where you can break a piece of veneer too. That's why I say make an extra piece. It does happen at this. This is about where it's going to happen, just being sloppy or careless. Using a new safety razor, I'm going to cut the mitered corners into the accent strips, or the fake mitered corners. It's really not much to it, but essentially just drawing it, essentially cutting it approximately at a 45-degree angle and getting the corners to meet up. They are cut simultaneously, so the angles are complementary. So if you're off a degree here or there, there's no gap. So just repeating it on all 4 corners, and using the heat. Again, the last thing you do is heat up the corners and get them stuck down as well. The edge banding between the bloodwood or the accent strip and the outside edge of the box goes on in the same fashion as the accent strip itself. I'm going to again repeat the iron-on veneer method. Here again, I'm just touching the edge, the join line between the bloodwood and the shadua, so that again, if it shrinks, it pulls from it shrinks from the unanchored side of the veneer, keeping the joint tight up against the bloodwood. Working my way slowly along the edge and then working towards the outer edge, but not allowing the veneer to come in contact at the corners. I'm going to again repeat the miter corner with the razor blade technique that I used to get the fake, essentially it's a fake miter joint. It doesn't take much effort to do this. It's just I'm pushing the veneer up against the bloodwood, keeping it tight as the veneer is being pushed down with the heat from the iron and anchored in place. Definitely want to make sure you get the veneer bonded to the outside veneer that you put on the outside of the box, because the veneer will actually become separated at some point. It would get a little pull off or splinter that you have to go back and fix later on. And getting the last piece of the edge banding complete. It'll be time to miter the corners. Making the mitered corners is the same process as the accent strip. Essentially taking the razor blade, putting it at the juncture at the corner between the outer band veneers, and pointing it out towards the corner of the box itself, keeping it in a straight line. Again, if you're off a degree or two, it's no big deal. Again, the actual angle is complementary, so it kind of balances itself out. You just try to get as close as possible to the corner itself. Because sometimes the cutoff piece gets trapped underneath the piece of veneer. You want to make sure you get it all out. Sometimes the veneer actually shatters a little bit. You don't want to iron that down a splinter underneath there. Then you have to really rework that corner. Just have to repeat this process 3 other times. It's usually not this difficult, but I'm trying to do it for the camera. Here it is, the last one. I'm showing you pretty much up close, getting it in the juncture between them, pointing it out towards the corner, and trying to keep it in line with the camera. My head's momentarily going to get in the way. And readjusting. I think I got it lined up there. I'm going to dig out the scrap or the cutoff from underneath. Just hit it with the iron, and that'll anchor all 4 corners down. And the lid's mostly complete. We got to sand off the excess. Now it's time to trim off the excess from the lid. Going to use the veneer solid and repeat just like we did for the side of the box. Use the veneer solid, just push it up against flush. Make several light passes. Wood fibers eventually will separate. Give it a quick inspection, and now I'm going to use in this case I got a felt block. That's my sanding block, and some fine sandpaper. I'm going to sand off the excess flush. Again, in the downward pull or downward stroke so you don't pull or lift up any of the wood fibers. It doesn't take much to get this to be sanded flush. You don't want to round it over either. And I'm just going to show 2 sides. It's a repeat of the other 2 sides, but I think you get the idea.